How was Jimmy Savile able to abuse so many people over such a long period at the BBC? The retired judge, Dame Janet Smith, has been trying to answer that question. Her report is not officially published yet, but a draft has been leaked to the news website Exaro. It says the BBC had a deferential culture, untouchable stars, and some senior managers who felt they were above the law. Well, Dame Janet's review team has said in response that this document is out of date. Mark Watts, the editor of Exaro News, is here in the studio with me now, and good morning to you.
Good morning.
Do you know how out of date this document is and what stage it was? They say it was a draft. Was it a very early draft?
It is the draft from which criticisms were passed to individuals as relevant and indeed to the BBC as an institution. So it's quite important to realise that the BBC as an institution knew about these criticisms, and they're extensive in this draft, more than a year ago. So that's the reference to it's an early draft. It is more than a year ago. Now, the other thing that's important to bear in mind is that the Smith Review team put out a statement in October of last year in which they said that following the Maxwellisation process, where people get to make the final responses to the criticisms, that they had not made any changes to the conclusions.
Right.
And one of the things that's going to be very interesting to see is, presumably that's true, but what about the kind of body of the report? Are we going to see changes there?
OK, so tell us what is in it. What Dame Janet at this year ago concluded as to what went wrong?
Well, at the core of it is, as you said, the deferential culture that she describes at the BBC. And works in two ways. Deference to stars who are untouchable, her word, but also deferential to management and a fear of management, as if you could believe it, above the law in some cases. Again, that's her phrase. And it's this deference that's at the core of why, despite many people at the BBC either knowing or having some idea of what Sir Jimmy Savile was up to, no one told anyone at the top. So Dame Janet Smith says in this draft that no one at the top of the BBC had a clue about what Savile was doing.
So despite her, considerable criticism of the BBC, her conclusion is that they couldn't have actually stopped it.
That's right. And the reason they couldn't have actually stopped it, so she finds, is because they were clueless. That's my word. She says they didn't know what was going on because everyone was too scared to tell them. So the BBC has to be careful here, because I've noticed in the early reporting that there's a sense of complacency. Oh, she says we haven't done anything wrong. No, that's not quite how it is. She does say that the BBC couldn't stop him because the BBC didn't know as an institution.
But the argument, of course, is they should have known.
Exactly.
She also, we're going back to some things from the 70s, we're talking about over decades, but she does make reference to the situation now in the BBC.
Yes, and this is something that really should be troubling the BBC as an institution, because we just described how, according to her findings, it's this refusal or this fear of reporting up, as it were, concerns, whistleblowing, if you like. She says that whistleblowing today is worse than it was at the BBC in Savile's time. And the reason she identifies for that is people are even more unsure about their positions at the BBC. There are a greater proportion of people who are freelance, and she says that's something that will deter people from reporting up. One of the episodes, for example, is about a woman who worked at the BBC. We haven't named any victims in what we've published. And she... Savile attempted to rape her, lured her back to his flat or caravan, I forget which it was, and attempted to rape her. She managed to escape. And she discussed with colleagues reporting this. And both she and colleagues that she discussed it with said, you better not do that because it's not going to do your position at the BBC much good. What an appalling culture that is that comes over in this report.
Well, I should say we did ask somebody from the BBC for an interview. They haven't said they will do one yet. Mark Watts, thanks very much.
Thank you.
The time is now 10 minutes past 8. How was Jimmy Savile able to abuse so many young people for so long at the BBC? That's what has been so hard to understand since we've learnt about the scale of his criminal behaviour. The answer, according to a leak of the draft of Dame Janet Smith's report, is in large part down to the deferential culture in the corporation. Deference to untouchable stars and to managers who acted and were treated as though they were above the law. Dame Janet is extremely critical of that culture and the scale of abuse. There were 61 incidents of sexual assault, including 4 rapes. But she concludes that because no one in a position of authority was told about it, they could not have stopped it. Well, Dame Janet's review team say that the document that is now in the public domain is out of date. They will be publishing the final version in the next few weeks. We, of course, asked someone from the BBC to comment on the leaked report, but no one has agreed to come on the programme this morning. Liz Dux is a lawyer at Slater & Gordon and represents some of those who say they were abused by Jimmy Savile. Will Wyatt is a former Deputy Director General of the BBC. He left the organisation in 1999 after more than 30 years here. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Will Wyatt, is this a picture of the BBC that's painted in this draft leaked report, a picture that you recognise?
Well, it's a pretty grim read. I've only been through it quickly. It's a fair and measured report, I thought, but it's terrible to read it. It's not quite what I recognise, but then I spent most of my career in the factual, more journalistic areas where presenters didn't come with a trail or a posse of fans and guests and supporters in the same way, and their relationship to the programmes was quite often slightly different. But it was, well, I'm not denying that what's in the report. I'm just saying I don't think it was universal in the place. In fact, I know it wasn't. But it was a deferential organisation. I think that is true. And people had a terrific loyalty to the programme they were on. And reading Dame Janet's report, or this version of it, that comes out as well. How people didn't want to hurt the show. They were afraid of going around talking about the star in an unpleasant way or telling what should have been told.
Liz Dux, what do you make of what she's produced?
Well, I think what will be most disturbing to my clients is that 107 witnesses gave evidence about rumours and suspicions pervading through the BBC, and yet to find that senior management could have done nothing to stop it. I don't think that those who were so badly affected by what he did to them will accept that.
I mean, in this draft of the report, she finds that nobody in a senior position at the BBC was ever aware of information that could have led to or assisted in the prosecution of Savile. I mean, she does say the BBC can be criticised for its failure to examine Savile's personality critically, but she doesn't suggest that would have stopped any sexual abuse of individuals.
I just find it incredible that 107 people gave evidence to her to say, yes, we knew of the rumours and suspicions, and that would not have filtered some way to the top, and someone at the top would not have looked into matters in greater detail. This is not a product of a bygone era, and what's even more worrying is at the end of the draft report, she asks herself, could it happen again today? And she says that the culture is still very, very much there.
I was going to come on to that in a minute, but just in terms of how this was allowed to happen, Will Wyatt, can you imagine a situation where everybody at certain levels seems to know or have rumours and people at the top just don't know?
Well, did everybody? I don't know. Clearly, quite a lot of people around the shows that Savile were in had rumours and stories. I honestly never heard anything, and I've discussed this with some of the senior colleagues who were mentioned in the report, and they've said the same, and I believe them.
So because relatively late on in the 90s, you were in very senior levels at the BBC. Are you saying that people you didn't know and nobody around you at those senior levels knew anything about this or heard stories or rumours?
I'd never heard anything, ever. As I said, I spent most of my career not in that sort of showbiz part of the BBC, but I didn't. And I have discussed it with others who I thought may have heard things. One or two have said, oh, well, one heard things about Savile, but never anything of this kind. Now, I'm not saying it didn't happen, and I'm not saying that people should not have known. They should have known, and there was something terribly wrong in particularly in the 70s and 80s, it seems, when these things just didn't rise up as they should have done. Because I know people who, if they did know that rape and so on, good God, you'd have to be a appalling person not to want to take action as a manager if that sort of story was around.
Although the interesting thing, and that Liz Dux makes reference to, is that in the final page of her report, Dame Janet suggests that people were extremely anxious to maintain their anonymity when they were talking to her and telling what was going on. And she suggests the position is... It was explained to me that in one respect, the position is even worse today than it was years ago, in that so many people are now employed on short-term contracts or on a freelance basis with little or no job security. They're even less likely to want to whistleblow.
Well, you would know that better than I, because I've not been there for 15 years. I'd be surprised that some of the freelance culture I guess it's clearly true. On the other hand, I would hope and believe now that the awareness of the sexual exploitation of children and the exploitation of power by famous people people are much more sensitive to that and would leap on it and look for it in a way that they didn't then. I would certainly hope that was the case.
Liz Dux, you are representing Jimmy Savile's victims, some of those who say that they were abused by him. Is the BBC worse than anybody else, or are we actually, because we're looking at a different time and largely a different culture, when perhaps people weren't so keen to report a rumour, and perhaps we're unfairly judging it on what happens today?
Well, don't forget that the BBC gave him that power and that celebrity that then allowed him to pervade into many other areas. And I don't think any of the victims can in any way be criticised for not directly reporting it.
No, of course not. But those around them, I just wonder if other organisations were better. I mean, he was abusing in other organisations apart from the BBC.
I don't think it's right to say anyone was better or worse, and I certainly don't think it's right to say everyone else missed it so the BBC can be excused. I think there was such a degree of suspicion about him at the BBC, and the way in which she describes behaviour was happening on Top of the Pops and on Radio 1 was just so unacceptable, even for that bygone era, that it is completely beggars belief that was allowed to carry on.
And it's certainly the case, we know, and not least from this report, from what Esther Ranson has said, when Childline, or it was when Child Watch was set up, a programme was first set up in the 70s, they thought that they were going to be getting concerns about bullying, and they were absolutely shocked that it was about abuse, and as a result they set up Childline. I mean, that's something, I suppose, that was part of the turn and the change in behaviour, Will Wyatt.
Well, I was closely involved in Child Watch and indeed setting up Childline with Esther. And and Esther said at the time, you must read some of these letters, Will, that we got in, which I did. And the terrible thing was, and it relates clearly to the victims we're talking about now, is that these things don't just happen and then forgotten. There were letters from women in their 70s and 80s going back and remembering what had happened to them. I have to say most of the majority of that was about sexual abuse in the home and in the immediate family or friends, rather than what Savile was clearly up to, which was exploiting his power as a popular performer to do these things.
But what comes across in this report, Liz Dux, about, not least, I mean, there are various elements, but what was going on around Top of the Pops is phenomenal.
Oh, it is phenomenal. And you know, my clients will give statements to say, you know, they were taken off to a dressing room in front of staff, led off as young children, and for that not to create questions as to why that was happening is just not acceptable.
It did create questions, though. They just weren't followed up adequately from what one can understand from this report.
Yes, but, you know, I find it beggars belief to know that producers of that programme did not pass those worries on, and to write this off as something that could not happen again is dangerous.
And to be fair, she doesn't do that. She says,
no, she doesn't.
One of her conclusions is, could it be happening again now? And she says, yes, absolutely. But although arguably you could say that about any organisation. But Will Wyatt, that point about Top of the Pops, how prevalent and how widespread and shocking some of the things that were going on. And as we know, in every single BBC building that Jimmy Savile worked in, he abused people. That is where people will struggle to see how it could not have gone up the chain, up the hierarchy within the BBC.
Well, I think one does struggle. I had never been to Top of the Pops, didn't know much about it, and really didn't hear stories. If you'd said, I guess, around the time that pop stars and I guess disc jockeys exploited their position, one would have not been surprised, but the thought that it was happening with young kids is just beyond belief. And I find, and what one reads about Top of the Pops then is pretty grim. But Dame Janet's investigated this, and she comes to the conclusion that it just didn't go up the chain. You could say Jolly well should have done, but I don't. It seems that it didn't.
And when you think back to the, I mean, you were there just towards the end of it, obviously, in the late 90s, that the BBC put this person in this position of power and allowed them the ability to do this and was unaware. What conclusion do you come to about the way that the BBC was operated, that was allowed to happen?
Well, Dame Janet does go into quite an interesting area, I think, which is where does someone's private life impinge on whether they're employable by the BBC or not? Clearly, Savile's private life was dreadful, and he should never have been employed by the BBC. But there is an issue.
But he made it his public life, effectively. I mean, we even know there was abuse on air at one point.
Well, I don't think anyone knew that at the time, did they? And I mean, there's no argument. He shouldn't have been. People should have known, and he shouldn't have been employed. But it's clear that people at the top didn't know, and he was employed, and that's what we've got to wrestle with now, and to make absolutely certain that whatever is in place in the BBC in terms of whistleblowing, child protection policies, and awareness of how people can use their power is right throughout the organisation, and that there are procedures in place to make it easy for people to report and get to the top quickly.
Will Wyatt, Liz Dux, thanks both very much. It's 9:04. In every BBC building where Jimmy Savile worked, he abused people. He was involved in at least 61 incidents of sexual assault, including 4 rapes. That is the conclusion of a draft of Dame Janet Smith's report into what he got up to at the BBC. It has been leaked to the news website Exaro, and it concludes that was possible because of the deferential culture at the corporation, where stars were untouchable and managers above the law. And yet she concludes there is no evidence that anybody at the more senior levels knew and so could not have stopped the abuse. Well, Steve Hewlett is the presenter of Radio 4's The Media Show, and he's here in the studio now. Morning, Steve.
Morning.
What do you make of this? And we should say it is a leak of a draft report. And from what we understood, it's effectively a year old.
Okay, well, I think the first thing to say is that nobody in this whole process can escape the clutches of 2020 hindsight. So by the time Dame Janet starts her review, she knows what Savile has done, more or less. All her witnesses know what Savile has done, more or less. And as readers of this report, we all know what Savile has done, more or less. And as a result, it's very, very hard not to look at some of the things that she has found, including, for example, talk about in plain sight. In Savile's own autobiography, 1974, he outlines what can only be described as the unhealthiest of attitudes towards his sexual appetite towards women and young girls. In 1969, an underage girl at Top of the Pops complains about being interfered with and is escorted from the premises. I mean, hundreds of people have said to her that they knew, or they thought they knew, they'd heard rumours and so on and so on and so on. So right in plain sight, this is all happening. Now, of course, all the things that, when we look at this with hindsight, it seems incredible, just incredible, beyond belief that they didn't know. But she's looked at it in detail, and as you've pointed out, could not be more categoric that the senior people did not know. So, no evidence that anyone in a position of authority at the BBC heard or knew of a complaint or concern about Savile but refused to act. And I do not think the BBC can be criticised for failing to uncover Savile's sexual deviancy. It could not be clearer.
And she sets out the reasons for this culture of deference, which she suggests in some part, and at least the lack of the whistleblowing, still exists today.
Well, she says in one part of the report that whistleblowing may be worse now than it was because of short-term contracts, less employment security. But she does say, it was said to me that. That looks like the evidence of a particular someone or a group someone who gave evidence said that. Whether that is strictly true, I'm not sure. And I think Will Wyatt's point to you earlier, which is that attitudes toward this kind of behaviour, I think have changed pretty fundamentally, which isn't to say it couldn't happen. I suppose it could. But she also says that the reason she thinks it might be she asks herself, is it possible that there are paedophiles in there now? She says, well, for two reasons. She says sex abusers are intelligent, manipulative and hard to track, so don't underestimate them. Secondly, celebrity power is, if anything, increasing, not diminishing.
OK, so how damaging is this for the BBC?
Well, in one sense, it could have been worse. If individual BBC managers at a senior level had been directly fingered and said, right, they knew they didn't do it, that would have been very, very, very hard to deal with. It leaves open questions about the BBC's culture now, but I think the big thing is this. Auntie is, at very least, even if we don't agree with her, she's our friend. Here is an organisation which doesn't look like your friend anymore. It looks like an organisation that, once upon a time at least, was up to no good.
Steve Hewlett, thank you very much.
You're welcome.